Hello and welcome to the Digital Insight, the technology and supply chain podcast that delivers valuable C-level perspective into the core issues surrounding business transformation and digital disruption. Each episode will bring you the most inspiring executive insights from those leading transformation strategies within the world's biggest and best-known companies. The Digital Insight. Disrupt, transform, evolve.
Welcome to the Digital Insight, the official podcast series for CPO Strategy and Interface magazines. Today, I'm joined by George Booth, Chief Procurement Officer at Lloyds Banking Group. In this episode, George explores risk assurance and whether it's become a top priority for the CPO of today. George also talks about how big data, AI, and blockchain are redefining the sourcing function and, in turn, redefining the role of the procurement professional. We also discuss how, in the digital age, balancing the need to identify and onboard newly emerging fintechs with the need to protect the business from inherent risks cause significant challenge, but also opportunity. As a way of kicking things off then, obviously, you work in procurement, but also from my perspective, I know you work in the financial space, so it's a bit different. I don't often speak to people in that sort of procurement area. Can you give me a bit of a rundown as to your career journey, and how, particularly obviously from that procurement perspective, and how you find yourself today, with Lloyds Bank?
Yeah, can do, Dale. So I started off in procurement in 1993. I graduated with a degree in economics and marketing, and I got a contractor's role working at Hewlett Packard. And basically, it was a buyer job, didn't really know much about it. And I ended up buying hardware, screws, and also packaging. And then I got onto the graduate program on a more formal footing and got a chance to work in finance, production, various other parts of the business, but always came back into the purchasing role and frankly haven't left since. So I spent about 7 years at Hewlett Packard in a variety of roles, up to and including global commodity management. Spent a lot of time traveling in the Far East, mid-Europe and the US. And then I was divested out to a company called Agilent Technologies. So I chose to go with them. It was a kind of spin-off post the tech bubble burst in 2000. And again, in a variety of supply chain roles, took on planning, took on kind of low cost country, transactional sourcing, global strategy type roles. And just continued my love affair, I guess, with all things procurement, purchasing, sourcing, supply chain. And then in 2007, decided to join Bank of Scotland. And they were recruiting a new role. And I guess on more of the indirect side. So I just wanted to get different industry sector experience. It also gave me a chance to spend more time in Scotland and the UK as my young family came along. And 2 years into that, there was the financial crash. So every 10 years, I seem to go through a crash of some sort. And then Lloyds Banking Group was formed with Lloyds TSB acquiring HBOS. And throughout that time, I've been in a variety of head of sourcing, category type roles, laterally before becoming the CPO of Lloyds almost 3 years ago now. I was for 4 years the IT sourcing director, and that was quite interesting in terms of the world of IT tech buying has evolved rapidly with the digitization of the industry, moving away from buying hardware and software to much more outcome-based SaaS type services. Yeah, in the last 3 years as a CPO, so been an interesting roller coaster as the function of sourcing evolves. And yeah, we can get into that a little bit in the discussion.
Yeah, and obviously, you touched upon it then. Obviously, you started back in 1993. You've obviously worked around the world. Like you said, you traveled a lot as part of your career. And you've said it there, it's procurement, sourcing, supply chain. It's a very different conversation. It's a very different ballpark than it was back then. I know this is a broad question, but how do you feel generally it's changed? How has the perception of it changed, and how has the role itself changed in towards of, it's become more strategic to a business?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think as the world has become a smaller place due to, technology for definite, from a society perspective, and as such, supply chains have grown from very localized footprints to globalized footprints, and with that, the profession has had to grow. So you have to become very international in your outlook, understanding different cultures, working across multiple time zones. So your leadership skills have been stretched from being able to talk to people and see them every day to often, having supply chains and indeed factories and clients that are global. So you have to be able to adopt and evolve in that world. It's become much higher paced. You're much more prone to global macroeconomic, geopolitical factors, happening and impacting your provision of goods and services. And with that, as being a business professional, ultimately delivering through sourcing or procurement, the core skills have ultimately remained the same, i.e., commercial nous and awareness, your ability to build and forge strong, deep relationships, your ability to manage multiple tasks, often live through a 24/7 type environment. And the sourcing skills, have again also evolved, where you may have just traditionally been looking at one or two local suppliers where you had long-term arrangements, to now much more agile world where you've got consortium buying, you've got many new players coming into various of the technology markets, and a lot of the big established suppliers are changing. They're being disrupted. They're going out of business, but with all these new entrants coming in, so it remains a very exciting, challenging, ever-evolving career path, and one I would definitely encourage anyone thinking about it to kind of put their toe in the water and go on the roller coaster.
And how do you go about? Obviously, you say it's exciting, it's changing, it's disruptive. Obviously, it can be challenging. From a personal perspective, then, obviously, from you as the procurement professional, and any procurement professional, what's the key to kind of staying ahead and making sure that you don't fall behind, because stuff is changing so fast, and the industry and the function is just evolving so rapidly that perhaps if you don't stay in tune with it all, you do fall behind. So how do you stay in touch with what's going on?
I think it's getting the balance right between, ultimately, a lot hasn't changed. So in our day-to-day existence, we buy things regularly, and we maintain and manage multiple relationships within your family, within your business, within your friend circle. So the core kind of activity of what we do remains fundamentally the same. You're managing transactions between two organizations in very complex relationship environments that are often good, but can be quite often challenging. And then everything's changed in the context of, I speak with my suppliers regularly. I meet new entrants in the market. I regularly go to forums. I'm part of the World Procurement 50, so that's a peer group of CPOs from all different industries, all geographies, all cultures and backgrounds around the world. So I keep tuned in. I look at TED Talks. I'm regularly on YouTube. I read a lot of industry articles, and I talk to my team. I've got 340 practitioners in my function, and every day they're at the various conferences with all the well-known brands. They're talking to my business clients who are ultimately solving customer problems. So it's just constantly tuning in with what's evolving, what's changing, and understanding things like blockchain, AI, big data. What are these things, and how do they impact my function and the tools and activities that drive us, versus how are they transforming our ultimate customers' lives, and within that, the supply chains between us. How do we shape them, evolve them? So it's just keeping plugged in, but also rooted in the reality of the very basics of what we do remain, consistent.
And you said there about you have 340 practitioners. You talk to your team. You're very much a procurement man. You've lived and breathed it for a long time. You understand it. You have, as much as obviously you're continuously learning and continuously reading and making sure that you are keeping up to date with things that are changing. What about your communication and conversations you have with the wider business? So the people that aren't traditionally procurement led, who perhaps don't have the best perspective. I know it's changing, but they perhaps still see procurement as in its old fashioned sort of way. How do you kind of communicate to the wider business the value and the importance and the strategic nature of procurement to them?
I think the first thing that we reflected on with that, because it's a great point and very important. I spend half my life probably talking internally, selling what we do, talking to my clients to understand the business problems they're trying to solve, and giving them a sense of the value we bring. So about 5 years ago, we changed the title of our function from procurement to sourcing, because procurement had evolved out of purchasing, and it was very functional, and we felt sourcing better reflected that at the core of what we do, it's all about sitting and understanding the business problems. So being able to speak the language of your business in the context of the customer issues they're trying to solve. And how do we go and source in a very complex supply chain environment the right solutions? So it's bringing the businesses with us. And a lot of the procurement purchasing practitioners were very functional in their language and approach. They would talk about a process. They would talk about, once you've decided what it is you want to buy, come and speak to us and we'll help you find the right supplier, put a contract in place, get you the right commercials, and we'll help you manage that through its life cycle in terms of supply chain or supplier relationship management. What we wanted to do was move the dial to say, we understand the market you're in and the evolving customer challenges that are out there. We believe there are solutions that are rooted in the supply chain that we can help you access and source in a much more collaborative way. So it was all about becoming more proactive as opposed to being a kind of seen as red tape or a transactional functional role. And that's been a massive breakthrough. So rebranding us, having much more proactive, deep and meaningful, richer conversations with the business way before they've ever thought of dealing with us. And that's really up the game in terms of capability in the team. We need professional business people who have to have particular sourcing, procurement, purchasing skills, but very much as a secondary consideration as opposed to the primary. Because if they don't understand the supply markets alongside the business market, then they're not going to source the best outcome.
No, absolutely. And, you touch upon something that one of my recent episodes, I spoke to a gentleman and he talked about how the lines and the traditional lines and traditional boundaries between this person's business unit and this person's business unit are now kind of blurring and almost vanishing because, you can't just rely on, well, he's a procurement professional and he's a business professional. Go to him for X, go to him for Y, when actually, those paths are now crossing more and more. Going back to what you said earlier then, of course, and a big thing, of course, working in the financial space, you talked about a financial crisis. Obviously risk is everything. Risk is a big thing and it affects a lot of things, particularly in that supply chain and that sort of sourcing space. How much is that? Obviously, I guess the answer is a lot, of course, but how much has risk now become a top priority, particularly from the perspective of there's been quite a few financial crises, there's been a few big things that have happened in the past. How has that shaped and influenced the role of the CPO now then?
Very much. I think there's always that kind of absolute truth or truism within sourcing that you have to deliver on your numbers, you have to deliver value, you have to deliver savings. And if you do that, you get to play, with the business. I would say that's been replaced, certainly in my experience, with managing supply chain risk. And at a very basic level, knowing who your immediate third-tier suppliers are, but who's supplying them and who's supplying them. And you can get into the fifth or sixth tier. And for us in financial services, we've outsourced, in banking quite significantly over the years. So whether that's in terms of credit and debit cards, obvious things like ATMs, the cash that we print and issue out, right through to all sorts of very intimate customer services that financial service organizations rely on others to perform. And all our IT kit, we don't build any of it. We buy it, we integrate it, we increasingly leverage through SaaS relationships access to the very latest technologies. And what keeps us alive, Dale, is that we think about who's got our data, who's got our customer data, our corporate data, who ultimately services our customers. So where's the potential for customer detriment or conduct risk? We think about, who's got a permanent or intermittent connection to the group through which malware will lurk. So if somebody's got a pipe into the group or connects with us through a VPN, we need to know about it. And we need to know who services our ability to, constantly provide 24/7 online digital banking. You just look at the industry stats. Banking, like many industries, suffers service outages. And I'm very conscious of the fact that can, in certain cases, be down to a supplier failure, either in terms of a component or an individual making a mistake. So my number one priority as a CPO is unashamedly ensuring that we manage that supply chain risk. We help educate our business colleagues who choose suppliers, who manage suppliers on these risks. And it's all about how do we get much more proactive and predictive. Now, we still deliver value. We still look to achieve optimal outcomes with our suppliers. Absolutely, that's true. And we look at sustainability, we look at innovation. But of the four things I do, which is deliver value, innovation, manage a sustainable and resilient supply chain, risk is definitely the one that tops the poll right now. And you just have to look at the global nature and the depth and breadth of complexity in these supply chains, which are interdependent, to understand the reasons behind that.
No, absolutely. And you mentioned there about predictability. And of course, innovation then comes into that, which of course is technology, and technology is completely redefining everything almost on a daily basis. You talked about earlier, you mentioned, you threw out some of the two sort of key phrases that we hear a lot now, blockchain and AI. And I always ask the same question, is that sometimes the more people say it, the more it just becomes, it's just a trend. It's just a fad. It's just a buzzword that people say. But what does it actually mean, particularly for you, as in Lloyds Bank in your role? What does big data and what does artificial intelligence and even blockchain, what does that mean, and how does it apply to what you are looking to achieve?
What it ultimately means for me is that it gives you the chance to go beyond human limitations in terms of compute power, knowledge, and aggregate awareness. So what I mean by that is, if I think of any particular hardware I buy, let's say for our data centers. So our data centers run computation and data storage for, in the case of Lloyds Banking Group, 30 plus million predominantly UK customers. If that supply chain is in any way threatened in terms of assurance of supply or compromise, I need to be able to know who supplies the first tier suppliers we deal with, who supplies at the second, third, fourth, fifth tier. So whenever there is an issue that arises through the access to the big data available, so whether it's social media feeds or Dun & Bradstreet live reports or BitSite monitoring on cyber risk vectors or any of the plethora of third-party tools that are out there, they are monitoring global supply chains 24/7. What is impossible for a human to do is to do that at the scale and pace and converting data into insight that we need. Therefore, artificial intelligence coupled with access to big data, and big data in the context of following the thread in your supply chain that tells you, if I go back to my manufacturing days, if there was an earthquake in Japan that damaged the major foundry that supplied silicon chips at a fourth tier, I would know today, if I could apply the technology available, that I would have a shortage in a factory in 2 weeks' time. Our safety stocks would have been exhausted, or alternate supplies needed to be immediately switched on. And something that would have broken the next day in the news on the wires, 20 years ago, would be immediately computed and analysed within minutes today. So that shows you the power of how that data and AI can help us. The challenge for the industry is to find the optimal blend and mix of human awareness and monitoring coupled with the technology and what it gives us. And I see definitely out there that there's huge strides being made. There's still issues in integrating it all up and giving you the risk vectors down to a supplier brand in the scale of what we want. There's a lot promised, but I'd say we're probably 50-60% of the way toward optimized solutions. But we have to keep pushing it, and it is here to stay. We're going to become more and more reliant on it. And I'm a big fan. I just wish we could get to some of the nuances being wrinkled out of it. Otherwise, we're not far away, but desperate to get more of it, but still healthily skeptical that we're going to need human interaction and involvement for some time to come.
Yeah, and you touched on something there about sort of, desperately wanting to get to it, but also healthily skeptical. And I think that can be applied generally to just the sort of technology conversation about any form of tech, because as more and more companies and more, businesses around the world are embracing and investing and implementing technology, is there a sense that perhaps some other companies perhaps are looking to do so just to stay in they sort of to try and catch up? So that competitors, we know that competitor has just invested in blockchain. Well, we need to be doing it now. Is there how important is it to try and not do that and keep that kind of skepticism, that level-headedness, to understand well, sure, blockchain's good for them, but we don't have a practical use for it right now or a business case for it right now, rather than just let's invest because others are investing?
Yeah, and there's probably two sides to that for me. One is internally to the sourcing function. So we've looked at robotics, AI, and better leveraging the data available. So, what's my spend cube look like? How can I cut and slice my data by supplier, by division, by business unit, by category? All of that stuff is really important, but it ain't going to move the needle in the competitiveness of my business. What's much more important is that external perspective. So if I can, for my organization, build more agile, more secure, more resilient supply chains that I can better understand in a 24/7 world, that gives a competitive advantage to maintain the service to our customers, the ongoing innovation. So if I can find out who's delivering the best innovation in the financial services space globally, as evidenced by the first contract they've signed with competitor X in Denmark or Australia, how can I access that without waiting for word of mouth to get to me? So there's some real practical applications of the data already out there. Like I mentioned, brands like Bitside, Dun & Bradstreet are much more digitally attuned to give more predictive kind of views of the world as opposed to retrospectively looking. But I think for me, it's going to take one or two of the big players in the market that have driven, the enterprise procurement platform solutions. They're going to, and I already see it, forge alliances with some of the new fintechs coming into the space and or build their own capability. Because ultimately, for large global organizations, they need that spine and backbone of running an enterprise, source to contract to pay solution. And within that, you will have a global system of the same suppliers used in multiple industries, multiple languages and countries, but actually supplying the same thing to all of the above. And I think for, without naming the brands, they're pretty obvious in our industry who they are. I think the challenge for them is how do they move as quickly and leverage the technology into their already established platforms and or forge alliances with the new, more nimble fintechs that are starting to offer value, as opposed to they're going to wither in the vine and we're going to be reliant on a whole range of new brands coming at us. So the challenge is very clearly out there, and the prize is huge, to be able to leverage the data through AI and blockchain and ultimately, active robots giving you 24/7 insight. That's going to be a real competitive advantage, particularly in the manufacturing sector or fast-moving goods environment, where trends and impact kind of a such immediate effect.
Well, that always raises an interesting point that I like to sort of look at is how much do you look across different industry sectors, or how much do you look to other, like you said then, how much do you look to them to see their applications of certain tech and their sort of even their procurement functions, and then obviously look to see how you can bring that into your business. How much does that happen where you are looking outward?
Yeah, all the time. I encourage my teams to get out there. So obviously we look at the supply chains within our supply base, and we've got a very diverse. We manage about 4,500 suppliers, many of whom are global. I talk to peers in other sectors. I always recruit typically from other sectors. One of my recent hires is one of my new supply chain director. Has joined us from the pharma industry. So we're always looking to bring in people with different perspectives. And it's really helpful to be reminded that the basics of sourcing, procurement, supply chain management remain consistent. But on the basics, you have to keep building and evolving and learning. And one of the best ways of doing that is ensuring you engage with, recruit from, are in dialogue with other sectors. And I'd like to think from a financial services point of view, we can offer insight back to the more traditional buying bits and parts in manufacturing and retail, for example.
And you touched upon a point there as well about recruitment, about new people, about having people in your team with different mindsets, different skill sets, different experiences. How much as the procurement function, the sourcing function even evolves, continuously changes as it transforms. How much do you do to make sure that you are, like you say, we're talking about AI, for example. The fear with AI is, well, it's just going to remove that human element, and obviously it's not. It's just going to change the expectation and the capability of the human element. So, how much do you invest and put time in to bring your team along as a digital transformation, or as they continuously evolves?
So there's two dynamics to that, I would say. One is that there's a generic level of awareness and understanding. So as I run my monthly colleague engagement calls and site visits, I always bring the latest technology thinking. And we run kind of internal competitions, if you will, where the teams can tell the story of the technology insight they've gained and or the technology breakthrough they've made. And it doesn't always happen within the IT team. It's happening more and more across the different sourcing teams. So, for example, one of the things we offer is part of a package current account is breakdown assurance. And customers clearly drive, and we've introduced some new technology with our partners where if they have a breakdown, that they can access an app that tells them where the repair van is, how far away, how long to come, and they can connect through that app. So there's an experience that we buy through a non-IT provider, but who's leveraging digital technology. So we make sure everybody understands the themes, the terms. We circulate colleagues going to different conferences. I had 3 colleagues away last week for 3 days at a technology conference in London, which they've come back with a ton of information and insight on. So they're going to spread the word. They're running wee podcasts and sharing that knowledge. So right across my entire team, we're generically uplifting their awareness of the digital transformation that's around them. Because everybody, as you good point earlier raised, is doing digital and tech today. Everybody's got a phone that when I started work, you'd need the computation scale of a kind of mid-sized office to replicate. And I think for me, Dale, that the key is everyone has to develop and learn and evolve their skills so they can speak the language of the business, their supply chains, and ultimately become an even better, sourcing and procurement professional. The second thing I would say is for our IT sourcing teams in particular, their big challenge is that there are more emerging options in the market than there have ever been. If you think of the traditional big IT tech players, they dominated the landscape for 30, 40 years. Nobody was fired for hiring Big Blue was always the adage. Whereas today, I'm looking at brands that didn't exist 6 months ago. Companies that are reaching unicorn valuations that 5 years ago weren't even thought of. So the challenge for the IT guys is not just understanding the technology lexicon that's evolving, but it's actually managing the complexity and the pace and the scale of change within the supply chains and the providers of service. And how do we get the balance right between onboarding, a 2-person company that's got some IP or an app or a product that we want to use and immediately can plug into our customers when they've got no financial track record, that there may be venture capitalist backed, they don't have all the IT protocol and protections that we would normally seek, but yet if we didn't take first mover advantage, somebody else would. So how do we adjust and manage our risk appetite whilst keeping our customers safe, but getting access to that new supply market? So a big challenge for our IT guys to keep on top of that.
And I guess then you've said it a few times already, really, but I'll ask, because I ask everyone the same sort of question is, if you were to give one piece of advice, if you were to, you say you say yourself, you tune into TED Talks, you do a lot of reading, you ensure that you're staying in tune with everything what's going on. If someone was to come to you, a CPO or anyone in the procurement profession, and was to ask you, obviously, it's very complex. It's both exciting, it's both challenging times. What would be the one piece of advice you would give to try and, I don't want to say what's the secret to success, but what would you sort of say is key to at least, going down the right path towards success?
I think it's ultimately ensure that you remain relevant in the conversation. And as a procurement or sourcing professional, by nature, you're going to buy different things. And some of these things are human capital in nature. Some of these things are physical parts and products you can touch. Other things are more virtual, like software. So my piece of advice is, irrespective of what you've bought, what you're buying, or what you want to buy, understand the common language of digital technology and the digital age that we're in, and build on what's in your pocket. Look at that phone and ask yourself how it's designed, what the components in it do, where do they come from? So if you were to disaggregate that phone, think of that supply chain. Think about what customers use it for. What do you use it for? What are the risks and issues with it? So understand the basic, phone in a way that translates to understanding any enterprise you might choose to be the CPO for. Because ultimately in that phone, you've got all the technology that you need to understand. You've got complex supply chains and complex customer needs. And the sourcing professional of 20 years ago would have looked at a mobile phone thinking people buy it to speak. Today, speaking through a phone is the 5th most common usage for it. So if you're still thinking people buy a phone to speak through, probably as a sourcing profession, you've not evolved with the times. So that would be my advice. And again, reflect, this is not complex. It can sound, for a sourcing professional that's been in the game for 20, 25 years, well, I've not bought IT, I don't understand digital. If you're saying that, you're not going to be long in the game. Whereas if you say, not bought IT, but I'm very technically savvy because of what's in my pocket, I fully understand it. I've understood key terms like robotics, blockchain, AI, big data, quantum computing. I have a kind of narrative in my head of what these things are and how they join up. And guess what? They're all in my phone. So people make it too complex, but they have to find a way of being relevant in that digital technology conversation.
Thank you for listening to the Digital Insight Podcast in association with theinterface.net and cpostrategy.com. The Digital Insight is brought to you by B2E Media Limited. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Please remember to subscribe, rate, and review, and don't forget to check out our podcast archive at www.b2e-media.com/podcast.